Should nominate me to decide who will decide, because really, Christopher, I'm quite fair, and I definitely do not believe in cutting off lips, and I hate padlocks. So I want to begin by saying that the motion of today, whether freedom of expression must include the license to offend, is in a sense really a moot point. It's a moot question, and I hope that all of you here today will consider rejecting it, throwing it out. The freedom we have to express ourselves does, in fact, enable us to offend. Christopher's doing it all the time in his own sweet way. In fact, one can even say that sometimes it is necessary to offend, and for good cause. The appropriate question to ask today is whether freedom of expression is absolute and limitless, or should it come with some social responsibility. In the U.S., we do have a value system that undergirds our free speech. Salient within this system is the value of fighting the suppression of truth. Let's face it, we're having this debate today. The reason why we're having this debate today is because a number of recent events, such as the Danish cartoon and the Pope Benedict's remarks on Islam, have brought this issue to the forefront. I'm mentioning these examples to frame the current affairs context for our discussion here today. There is no doubt in my mind that there are many issues, many suppressed truths, particularly within the Muslim world, that very badly need to be brought to light. I do not need to go through the litany of problems faced, for instance, by women in various parts of the Muslim world and the rest of the global south, all of which need to be discussed. There's also no doubt in my mind that when it comes to religion, Muslims need to engage in a very honest and open discussion about many of the values that they espouse. Whether they are in accordance with the teachings of Islam is another matter entirely. There are, however, certain kinds of speech that undermine the very values that liberty of expression is meant to advance. Take, for example, the infamous Danish cartoon protests. To put it into context, we live in an environment, and this is especially true of Europe, where Muslims constantly face xenophobia. While the overwhelming majority of the world's 1.2 billion Muslims do not partake in any violent actions in response to these political cartoons, a tiny, minuscule minority has grabbed the world's attention and apparently now has absolute command of how Muslims are to be perceived. This is coupled with a time when a new generation of European-born Muslims have emerged that routinely face discrimination, alienation, and are often perceived as threat in their own countries. And all this, while the violence in Iraq continues to surpass its already shocking levels. Clearly, we are living in a very tense time. In such a situation, for a right-of-center Danish newspaper to come out with cartoons that show the Prophet of Islam with a bomb in his turban, with a sword in his hand, and with a menacing look on his face does nothing, absolutely nothing, to advance desperately needed dialogue or enlighten people in any positive way. If it does anything at all, it serves to suppress constructive dialogue by fueling extremist sentiments. It is important to note that this example has little to do with religion, though I think Philip and Krista would probably tell you that's the case. This isn't about drawing the prophet, for which there are many historical precedents in traditional Muslim art. To see the situation clearly, we must all understand nuance. That's what intellectuals are here for nuance, for teaching us the nuance. My Jewish friend called me right after the cartoon crisis. Jewish rabbi friend called me, said, "What are you doing about the cartoons?" I said, "What are we going to do? It's just a cartoon." He says, "No, don't ever accept it. This is what they did to us in Germany. They started with the cartoons."
Christopher, come on. Christopher, come on. Daisy, this will not be deducted from your time.
So when you publish cartoons, which of course are a form of entertainment and hence immensely popular, and Signe, I love that cartoon of the, Radical Islam contest. Immensely popular as a medium for conveying a particular message. Or you give a speech, a person in a position of immense power like the Pope, which further drives people apart and cements stereotypes. You're using public discourse to malign the way an already marginalized community is perceived. And this, my friends, is not in accordance with our foundational values of free speech. This is un-American. The point is not whether such things can or cannot be published, but of course, they are published. Who's preventing them? The issue is whether there's any wisdom in showing the Prophet of Islam with a bomb in his turban, no less. This is the sort of thing that furthers that familiar yet dangerous and unsound argument. Some Muslim men are terrorists, therefore all or even most Muslim men are terrorists. Now, this last statement is certainly something we can say, something that is enshrined in free speech, but is it true? Is it responsible? Does it elevate the public discourse? Or is it simply racist, xenophobic drivel that isn't half as clever as it purports to be? There are a few additional things that I would like to say. While modern technology has allowed us to improve our communication, it also means that ideas, news, and statements can be disseminated at a global level very rapidly. The upshot is that the global distance is of little relevance in assessing how close we are to each other. So the notion of space, of sharing space with our neighbors, needs to be negotiated and re-examined. What is needed now is a heightened sense of awareness that enables us to distinguish between useful and useless affronts. Truly, few things are more useless than statements that exasperate bigotry and racism. Finally, in keeping with my previous point, I want to make a point about individual psychology in various societies. We're always shocked at how people in the global south react vociferously, especially my people, Muslims, and at a time violently, to what we see as simple free speech, which may or may not undermine their value system. What we do not realize in our dismay is that in societies where the basics are not guarantees, where one's life, liberty, property, family are not protected, individuals deal with disparities by developing a greater collective consciousness, where one identifies strongly with a larger community, in our case the Ummah, and the collective values it represents. Something that is perceived to threaten or undermine those values are resolved not at an individual level, but are resolved in a group dynamic, which can sometimes result in chaotic mob reaction, which you're all familiar with. In an environment defined by major uncertainties, heightened inequities, depictions like the Danish cartoons are perceived as yet another attack on what are, for some people, sadly remain their final salvation, their dignity and their faith. And Signe's right, religious people are the touchiest. It should come as no surprise then to see that
Daisy, that's time.
I want to just finish one last.
Finish the sentence.
Okay.
Oh, stop.
I want to know who that rabbi was.
We'll get to that.
Name that
Christopher.
The rabbi is my secret weapon, and I told him I would never do this. Ultimately, the question to ask is, do we use our free speech to insult and already marginalized people? Or do we use it to advance and enhance a desperately needed discourse between people living in an increasingly interconnected world? I hope you'll throw out the other motion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Daisy Khan. Before we get to the questions, it is now, I am now ready to announce the results of the pre-debate vote. Before the debate, 177 of you voted for the proposition, 25 against, and 24 don't know. So we'll see if that changes. We're now ready to begin the Q&A portion of the program. I will call on the questioners. Someone on each side of the auditorium will come to you with a microphone. Please stand when you ask your question, and I ask that please make your question short and to the point. Members of the press should identify themselves as such. Members of the audience who are not the press can identify themselves or not as they see fit. Why don't you, sir, ask the first question?
My name is Barry Fredericks. I have a question. Have you all forgotten about Galileo? I mean, this conversation about religious problems and insulting people, I mean, we've tried that case in the 13th century. Do we want to go back? I know there are groups in the Islamic world that like to go back to the 13th century, but do we really want to make that argument?
Okay, that's a good question. Who would like to respond?
I'm for going back to the 13th